For almost 2 decades, South Park was the king of episodic television. You could tune in any Wednesday night and watch Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny get into whatever insane situation Trey Parker and Matt Stone cooked up that week. Then next week, everything would reset like nothing happened. That was the formula, and it worked brilliantly. Until suddenly, it didn't. Or rather, until the creators decided to blow up their own formula and try something completely different. Starting around 2014, South Park began experimenting with serialized storytelling. Plot threads started carrying over from episode to episode. Characters referenced things that happened weeks earlier. Entire seasons became single continuous narratives. For a show that had spent nearly 20 years perfecting the art of standalone episodes, this was a massive shift. And it didn't happen by accident. It happened because Matt and Trey got bored, tried something new, created some of their best work, and then ran headfirst into the reality of Donald Trump winning the presidency and realized they'd painted themselves into a corner they couldn't escape. The episodic foundation, building a formula that worked. Before we talk about how South Park broke its own rules, we need to understand what those rules were in the first place. From the premiere in 1997 through season 17 in 2013, South Park was aggressively episodic. Each Wednesday brought a completely new story. Sure, there were recurring characters and locations, and the show developed its own internal mythology over time. But fundamentally, every episode stood alone. You could watch them in any order and still understand exactly what was happening. This wasn't just a creative choice. It was baked into the DNA of how South Park got made. The entire production operated on a 6-day cycle that became legendary in television history. The 2011 documentary 6 Days to Air pulled back the curtain on this insane process. Thursday morning, Trey and Matt would show up at the office with no idea what the episode would be about. They'd spend Thursday and Friday brainstorming and writing. Saturday through Tuesday would be animation, voice recording, and editing. Then, Wednesday at midnight, they'd deliver the finished episode to Comedy Central just hours before it aired. Every single week, they started from scratch, and this breakneck schedule meant they could comment on events that happened just days earlier. When Obama won the election in 2008, South Park had an episode about it less than 24 hours later. That kind of topical relevance was their superpower, but it also meant they couldn't plan ahead. They couldn't set up elaborate storylines that paid off weeks later because they literally didn't know what would happen in those future episodes yet. The episodic format wasn't just a preference, and it was a necessity born from their production method. The episodes from this era are time capsules of American culture. They'd tackle whatever was dominating headlines or pop culture that particular week, tear it apart with their signature blend of crude humor and sharp satire, then move on. The controversy over Janet Jackson's Super Bowl wardrobe malfunction became an episode. The Terry Schiavo Right to Die case became an episode. The obsession with Paris Hilton became an episode. And South Park was the animated ID of American society, reacting to cultural moments in real time. But here's the thing about that approach. After you've done it for almost 20 years, after you've made over 200 episodes using the exact same formula, even the most successful formula in the world can start feeling stale. Not to audiences necessarily, but to the people making it. Trey Parker and Matt Stone had built a machine that worked perfectly, and they were getting bored with it. The first hints of continuity. South Park didn't just wake up one day in 2014 and decide to become serialized. The seeds were planted much earlier. though mostly by accident. The show had always played with continuity here and there. Kenny's deaths became a running gag that eventually turned into actual plot points about why he kept coming back. The Coon trilogy in season 14 told a superhero story across 3 consecutive episodes. The 2007 Imagination Land trilogy created a massive 3-part adventure that required watching all 3 episodes to understand the full story. These multi-part episodes proved that South Park could sustain a narrative beyond 22 minutes. They showed that Trey and Matt could plan ahead when they wanted to, but they were always presented as special events, not the new normal. After Imagination Land ended, the show went right back to standalone episodes. The multi-parters were experiments, not a format change. The real shift started happening more subtly in the later seasons. Character development that actually stuck around began appearing more frequently. Randy Marsh's evolution from background dad to central character happened gradually over years. Butters went from occasional side character to essential cast member. These weren't dramatic changes, but they represented something different. The show was building a history that mattered, as season 17 in 2013 featured the introduction of Randy's hologram startup, which became a running element throughout that season. It wasn't full serialization, but it was continuous storytelling in a way South Park hadn't really done before. Episodes could still stand alone, but there were threads connecting them. It was like the show was testing the waters, seeing how it felt to have some continuity without fully committing to it. And Matt and Trey started talking about wanting to do things differently. In interviews, they'd mentioned getting bored with the standard episode structure. They'd done every variation of the basic formula. They'd satirized every type of current event. They'd explored every possible combination of their characters. After nearly 20 years, the challenge wasn't making good episodes anymore. The challenge was keeping themselves interested in making episodes at all. At season 18, testing the waters. The shift really began in season 18, which aired from September to December 2014. This wasn't fully serialized television yet, but it was South Park dipping its toes into continuity in a more deliberate way than ever before. Most episodes could still stand alone, but recurring elements threaded through the season in ways that rewarded viewers who watched every week. The season's biggest ongoing storyline involved Randy Marsh becoming the pop star lord. Yes, really, our Randy adopted a female alter ego and became an internationally famous musician. And this plot thread carried through multiple episodes. It was absurd even by South Park standards, but it worked because the show committed to it as more than just a one-off joke. Randy being Lord became a fact of that season's reality. What made this approach interesting was how it coexisted with the show's traditional strengths. Individual episodes still focused on their own topics, and one week would be about drones and privacy, the next about Washington football team names, then commentary on the Ebola panic. But these standalone stories existed within a season that had an ongoing narrative current running beneath them. It was like South Park discovered it could do both things at once. The season premiere, Go Fund Yourself, kicked things off with the boys starting a company and immediately dealing with Washington Redskins trademark issues, and the episode worked fine on its own, but it set up threads that would pay off later. That was new. South Park had never really cared about setting things up before. Everything happened in the moment, then disappeared. Later in the season, Grounded Vindaloop dealt with virtual reality and Oculus Rift technology. It was a perfectly fine standalone episode about how VR was going to mess with people's perception of reality. But it also continued developing the season's running themes about technology and identity in ways that connected to earlier episodes. Not in obvious, heavy-handed ways, but the connections were there if you were paying attention. By the time season 18 ended with Happy Holograms, which brought back Randy's hologram company and tied together various threads from throughout the season, South Park had proven something important, and they could maintain their ability to comment on current events while also building longer narrative arcs. The two approaches didn't have to be mutually exclusive. This realization would lead directly to what came next. In Vanity Fair interviews from 2016, Trey Parker explained that they didn't set out to make season 18 serialized. They just started noticing that elements from one episode were interesting enough to bring back in the next. They'd introduce something planning to drop it immediately, then realized they wanted to keep playing with it. The serialization happened organically, almost by accident, which makes sense given their production process. They couldn't really plan serialization even if they wanted to, because they were making everything up week by week anyway. But season 18 taught them something valuable. It taught them that following these impulses to continue stories felt exciting in a way the old format had stopped feeling. After nearly 2 decades of resetting everything every week, having consequences that lasted felt fresh. It made them want to push further. Season 19, the full serial plunge. If season 18 was South Park testing the serialization waters, season 19 was them cannonballing into the deep end. This was the first season where every single episode connected to every other episode. You couldn't just drop in randomly anymore. You needed to watch from the beginning to understand what was happening. It was a complete departure from everything South Park had been for 18 years. The season premiered in September 2015 with Stunning and Brave, which introduced PC Principal as the new head of South Park Elementary. In a less serialized version of the show, PC Principal might have appeared for one episode making jokes about political correctness, then disappeared forever. Instead, he became the catalyst for the entire season. His arrival set off a chain reaction of events that would play out over all 10 episodes. PC Principal wasn't just a character. He represented South Park's commentary on how American culture was changing in 2015. The rise of social media had made everyone more aware of saying the wrong thing. Call-out culture was becoming mainstream. People were being fired for decade-old tweets, as South Park looked at this landscape and created a character who was the physical embodiment of aggressive political correctness, then made him the principal of an elementary school where 9-year-olds had to navigate this new social reality. But PC Principal's introduction was just the beginning. The season quickly expanded to include gentrification, with the town suddenly getting a Whole Foods and transforming into a hipper, more expensive version of itself. And this connected to Randy Marsh trying to improve South Park's image, which connected to the arrival of PC culture, which connected to broader questions about authenticity and change. Every episode added another layer to this interconnected web of storylines. The season's most audacious move was making Mr. Garrison a Donald Trump stand-in. This was late 2015, when Trump's presidential campaign was still viewed by many as a publicity stunt that wouldn't last, as South Park went all in on the parody anyway, having Garrison adopt Trump's speaking style, policy positions, and even his orange complexion. It started as satire of Trump's campaign rhetoric, but as the real campaign continued and Trump's popularity grew, the show's version of events started paralleling reality in uncomfortable ways. Running alongside all this was a plot about ads becoming sentient and manipulative, with characters unable to distinguish between editorial content and advertising. This storyline tapped into real anxieties about native advertising and how commercial content was invading every aspect of digital life. The ads literally became characters in the show, with speaking roles and storylines, blurring the line between content and commerce in ways that felt both ridiculous and uncomfortably prescient. What made season 19 remarkable was how it wove all these threads together. PC Principal's crusade to make the school more politically correct connected to the gentrification making the town more upscale, which connected to Randy's attempt to rebrand South Park, which connected to the broader cultural conversations about identity and authenticity that Trump's campaign was exploiting. Every episode built on the previous ones while still managing to comment on current events. The critical response was fascinating, and publications like the New York Times called it ambitious and praised how the serialized format let the show explore themes with more depth than standalone episodes allowed. The season felt cohesive in a way South Park never had before. It was telling a complete story about America in 2015, using the same satirical tools the show had always employed, but in a new narrative structure. Trey Parker later explained that they never intended to make season 19 fully serialized, and they made what they described as a conscious decision to plan less than usual. They'd show up that first week with only the vaguest idea of what the season would be about, then let each episode inform the next. While making the premiere, they thought PC Principal would die at the end, and they'd move on to something completely different for episode 2. Instead, they liked the character enough to keep him around, and suddenly they had a through line for the season. Matt Stone described it as reacting to what was working week by week instead of having some grand design. The serialization emerged naturally from their process. An element would work well in one episode, so they'd bring it back in the next, then build on it the week after that. By the time they were halfway through the season, they'd accidentally created their first truly serialized season of South Park, and they loved it. The season ended with everything connected. PC Principal survived and remained at the school. The ad storyline reached a climax. Garrison's presidential campaign continued. The town's gentrification was complete. Unlike previous seasons, where the finale was just another episode, this finale felt like the culmination of 10 weeks of storytelling. It was satisfying in a way only serialized television can be. Season 20. Serialization reaches its peak and then crashes. After the success of season 19, Trey and Matt decided to go even bigger with season 20. This would be their most ambitious attempt at serialized storytelling yet, with multiple interconnected plot lines that would all presumably come together by the finale. They started the season in September 2016 with Member Berries, and immediately established the main threads that would run through the entire season. The Member Berries themselves were perfect South Park absurdism. These little sentient grape-like creatures that spoke in soothing voices and made people nostalgic for the past. They'd say things like, "Remember Chewbacca?" and "Remember when there weren't so many Mexicans?" starting sweet and innocent before revealing their darker, more reactionary nature. They were South Park's way of examining nostalgia culture and the Make America Great Again sentiment that was dominating the 2016 election. Speaking of the election, mister, Garrison continued his Trump parody, but now it had consequences. The season committed to following this storyline all the way through the actual election, which was scheduled to happen midway through the season's run. This was incredibly risky from a production standpoint. They'd have to create episodes responding to election results they couldn't predict, all while maintaining their usual one-week turnaround. The season also introduced a major trolling storyline. Our Carl's dad, Gerald, became a secret internet troll named SkankHunt42, harassing women online and creating gender divisions at South Park Elementary. The boys and girls stopped talking to each other. Cartman quit Twitter entirely in protest. Meanwhile, Denmark announced they were creating TrollTrace, a program that could reveal everyone's complete internet history. The tension between online anonymity and accountability became a season-long examination of internet culture. And then there was the Cartman and Heidi relationship. In one of the show's Stranger Choices, they had Cartman develop genuine feelings for Heidi Turner after both quit social media. Their relationship became surprisingly sweet, showing a side of Cartman viewers had never seen. It added an emotional through line to a season otherwise focused on satire and social commentary. For the first 6 or 7 episodes, all these pieces seemed to be building towards something. The member berries were infiltrating government. Gerald's trolling was escalating internationally. The TrollTrace program threatened to expose everyone's secrets. Garrison's campaign was surging despite his attempts to sabotage it, because he realized he didn't actually want to win. It was intricate, interconnected storytelling that felt like it was all heading somewhere meaningful. Then Donald Trump actually won the election, and this completely destroyed whatever ending Trey and Matt had been planning. They'd clearly assumed Hillary Clinton would win, like most of America did. Their episodes were building toward a Garrison presidency being a ridiculous impossibility, a commentary on how dangerously close we came to electing someone manifestly unqualified. But then it actually happened. Garrison, their Trump stand-in, had to become president in the show because Trump had become president in real life. The final few episodes of season 20 became a scramble to deal with this new reality. The storylines that had been carefully building for weeks suddenly had to change direction mid-flight. The season finale, appropriately titled The End of Serialization as We Know It, tried to bring everything together, but it felt rushed and unsatisfying compared to the meticulous setup. Too many threads got resolved too quickly or just abandoned entirely. The member berries ended up in the Pentagon, making ominous plans about stormtroopers. Gerald's trolling arc concluded with him literally destroying the internet to avoid being exposed, but facing no real consequences. The TrollTrace program that had been building all season got shut down almost as an afterthought. Cartman's relationship with Heidi somehow transitioned into him getting visions of life on Mars. Nothing felt like it received the payoff it deserved. Trey Parker and Matt Stone were remarkably honest about what went wrong. In multiple interviews after the season ended, they admitted that trying to serialize a show about current events during an unpredictable election had trapped them. They'd built a narrative structure that required planning ahead, but their entire production method was designed around reacting to events as they happened. Those two approaches were fundamentally incompatible, and the Trump win exposed that incompatibility in the worst possible way. The ratings were actually strong throughout season 20. The premiere member berries got their highest numbers since 2006, but the critical response to the season overall was mixed. Some praised the ambition and the early episodes. Others felt the season collapsed under its own complexity. The fan community was deeply divided, and with some loving the serialized approach, and others desperately wanting the show to return to standalone episodes. More importantly, Trey and Matt themselves weren't satisfied. They'd created something that felt restricting rather than liberating. The serialization was supposed to open up new creative possibilities, but instead, it had locked them into storylines they couldn't escape. The Mr. Garrison character was now president, and they'd have to deal with that for potentially years, and they'd committed to following the Trump presidency through their parody character. And they were already tired of it. Season 21. Pulling back from the edge. When Season 21 premiered in September 2017, the change was immediate and obvious. South Park wasn't completely abandoning continuity, but it wasn't doubling down on serialization either. Instead, the show found a middle ground that would define its approach for the next several years. In interviews before the season started, and both Trey and Matt were candid about wanting to return to a more flexible format. Trey told The Hollywood Reporter, "Last season, we really tried to do a serialized thing, and it was just really hard. In some ways it was cool, and in some ways it trapped us. The way we do that show is not compatible with full serialization." Matt added that they didn't appreciate how valuable it was to have tonally different episodes week to week until they lost that ability. And one week could be about the kids at school, the next about Randy's latest obsession, then an episode focusing entirely on Cartman and his schemes. That variety was something they'd taken for granted during the episodic era, and they wanted it back. Season 21 maintained some ongoing elements from the previous seasons. Mr. Garrison remained president throughout the run, creating a constant background reality the show had to acknowledge. Cartman's relationship with Heidi continued, becoming increasingly toxic as the season progressed, and Cartman reverted to his manipulative nature. PC Principal and Vice Principal Strong Woman were still around, now developing their own romance and eventually having PC babies together. But the crucial difference was that each episode could now stand alone again. You didn't need to have watched the previous weeks to understand what was happening. The premiere White People Renovating Houses dealt with Confederate monuments and the Charlottesville rally. You could watch it without knowing anything else about the season. The next episode, Put It Down, focused on North Korea tensions and school shooting anxieties. Again, completely standalone. This approach let South Park return to its strength of topical relevance. They could comment on Colin Kaepernick's national anthem protests one week, then pivot to Twitter harassment the next, and it without worrying about how these topics connected to some season-long narrative. The flexibility was back. The season did maintain some running threads, particularly Cartman's deteriorating relationship with Heidi, which served as a dark examination of abusive relationships. But these threads didn't dominate every episode. They'd appear when relevant, then fade into the background when the show wanted to focus on something else. It was continuity without serialization, uncharacter development without narrative imprisonment. Critically, Season 21 was praised for finding this balance. Reviews highlighted how the show had learned from Season 20's mistakes and created a format that worked with, rather than against, its production process. Episodes felt less constrained, more willing to take risks and go in unexpected directions, because they didn't have to set up future installments. The ratings told an interesting story. While Season 21's numbers were down from Season 20's artificially high premiere, they stabilized at solid levels, and the show maintained its position as one of Comedy Central's flagship programs. More importantly, the creative team seemed happier. They were making the show they wanted to make again, rather than serving some format they'd imposed on themselves. The return to episodic, mostly. From Season 22 onward through the mid-20s, and South Park settled into what you might call post-serialization. The show remembered the lessons learned from its experimental years, but didn't abandon episodic storytelling. Instead, it became more sophisticated about when and how to use continuity. Season 22, which premiered in September 2018, introduced Tegrity Farms. Randy Marsh, frustrated with modern life and gentrification, bought a marijuana farm and moved his family out of South Park proper, and this became a recurring setting and storyline that would persist for several years. But crucially, it didn't dominate every single episode. Some weeks focused on Tegrity Farms. Others didn't mention it at all. The farm existed as an ongoing element of the show's world, without forcing every story to revolve around it. This approach let the creators have their cake and eat it too. They could develop long-running character arcs and storylines when they wanted to, unlike watching Randy's journey from reluctant weed farmer to obsessed entrepreneur to tired burnout. But they could also do completely standalone episodes whenever they felt like it. An episode about school shootings becoming so normalized that nobody even notices them anymore didn't need to reference Tegrity Farms at all. Season 23 in 2019 played with this even more. The first 6 episodes formed a loose Tegrity Farms arc, with each episode's theme song getting rewritten to focus on the farm and Randy's latest schemes. But then the second half of the season dropped the Tegrity element almost entirely and returned to more traditional South Park storytelling. It was serialization when it served the creative vision, not because they'd committed to maintaining it. The show also started playing with ongoing background elements in clever ways. But PC Principal and Strong Woman's PC Babies became recurring characters who'd pop up occasionally without needing explanation. Towley became permanently associated with Tegrity Farms, creating his own subplot about marijuana addiction. These elements rewarded longtime viewers without alienating casual ones. What's interesting is how this approach matched what television in general was doing in the late 2000s. While South Park was pulling back from full serialization, other comedies were experimenting with it more. Shows like Arrested Development had proven that comedies could sustain complex ongoing narratives. Streaming services were encouraging season-long arcs that worked better for binge-watching. South Park went in the opposite direction, valuing flexibility over narrative cohesion. Trey Parker explained to The Hollywood Reporter in 2021, "We would like to get back to where each week we can do something totally different. We tried to experiment with serialization. That had mixed results." Matt Stone added that past years had been dominated by Trump and politics and the pandemic, and they felt trapped talking about larger issues when they wanted the freedom to be silly and random. This philosophy guided the show through seasons 22, 23, and into the special era that began during the pandemic. The 2020 COVID specials demonstrated the approach perfectly, and they were standalone hour-long specials that commented on the pandemic and related issues, but they didn't lock the show into some ongoing COVID storyline that would dominate future episodes. They could address the current moment, then move on. The 6 days to air problem understanding. South Park's serialization experiment requires understanding the production method that made the show unique in the first place, and the 2011 documentary 6 Days to Air revealed in excruciating detail how every episode gets made, and it exposed why serialization was always going to be difficult for this particular show. Most television shows work months in advance. Scripts get written and rewritten. Animation happens over weeks or months. Voice recording is scheduled far ahead of time. By the time an episode airs, it was completed weeks or even months earlier. This gives writers the ability to plan and to set up storylines that will pay off later, to ensure everything fits together into a cohesive whole. South Park throws all of that out the window. Every Thursday morning during production, Trey Parker and Matt Stone walk into their office with essentially nothing. They don't know what the episode will be about. They haven't written a script. They have 6 days to go from blank page to finished episode airing on Comedy Central. Thursday and Friday are spent in the writer's room and talking through ideas, debating what's funny, trying to find that kernel of an idea worth building 22 minutes of television around. This is the most stressful part of the process, because if they can't crack the story by Friday night, the entire schedule falls apart. The documentary shows multiple moments of Trey in near panic, because they haven't figured out the episode yet, and time is running out. Saturday through Monday is when the episode actually gets made. Animation happens in real time. Voice recording happens as scenes get finished. Editing happens as shots are completed. There's no time for extensive revisions or second guessing. Decisions get made quickly because there's no alternative. By Monday night or Tuesday morning, they're rushing to finish the final edits. Tuesday afternoon, the completed episode gets physically driven to a satellite uplink facility, where it's transmitted to Comedy Central in New York. Wednesday at midnight, it airs on television. The turnaround from "we have no idea what this episode will be" to "millions of people are watching it" is less than a week. This breakneck pace is what gave South Park its edge. When the 2016 election happened on a Tuesday night, South Park had an episode about it airing Wednesday. They could react to viral moments and breaking news in ways no other show could match. That immediacy was their competitive advantage, but it also meant they couldn't plan ahead. Not really, and they could have vague ideas about where character arcs might go, but they couldn't script out an entire season in advance. They didn't know what would happen in the world that would demand their attention. They couldn't set up intricate plot threads that required specific payoffs because they didn't know what future episodes would need to address. When they tried full serialization in seasons 19 and 20, they were fighting against their own process. Each week, they'd have to remember what threads they'd established in previous episodes and figure out how to advance them, while also commenting on whatever had happened in the news that week. It added layers of complexity to an already insane production schedule. The Trump election in season 20 exposed the fundamental incompatibility. They'd built a season around the assumption of a specific election result, but they couldn't change course because they were making episodes 1 week at a time without the ability to go back and revise earlier installments. They'd trapped themselves in a narrative that no longer made sense, and their production method gave them no way to escape. This is why their partial return to episodic storytelling made so much sense. By keeping most episodes standalone with only occasional continuity, they preserved the flexibility their production method required, and they could wake up Thursday morning, see that something insane had happened in the news, and dedicate that week's episode entirely to responding to it without worrying about how it connected to some season-long narrative. The documentary shows Trey Parker saying he always wishes he had one more day to work on an episode, but the deadline forces them to be done. Without that deadline, he thinks they'd never finish anything. The pressure is built into the process, and it's both what makes South Park possible and what makes serialization nearly impossible for them to sustain. Impact on characters and storytelling. The serialization years fundamentally changed some aspects of South Park in ways that persisted even after they returned to mostly episodic storytelling. Characters that emerged during the serialized seasons stuck around. Storylines that began in that era continued developing. The show couldn't fully return to the status quo even if it wanted to. A PC principle is the most obvious example. He was introduced in the season 19 premiere Stunning and Brave, and could easily have been a one-episode character mocking political correctness before vanishing like so many South Park characters before him. Instead, he became a permanent fixture. He's been the school principal for nearly 10 years now, outlasting Principal Victoria, who had been there since season 1, and the character evolved from a one-dimensional parody into someone with depth and genuine character development, getting married, having kids, and becoming more nuanced in how the show uses him. The same goes for Randy's evolution. While Randy had been a major character for years before serialization, his transformation into the show's de facto protagonist accelerated during the Tegrity Farms era. The serialized approach to his marijuana farming business meant we could watch his journey over years rather than just individual episodes. He went from hapless dad to obsessed entrepreneur to someone who fundamentally changed the family's entire life. And that character arc only worked because the show maintained continuity across seasons. The boys themselves changed too, though more subtly. Cartman's relationship with Heidi in seasons 20 and 21 showed sides of his character we'd never seen, and he was capable of genuine affection, even if it ultimately got corrupted by his narcissism. That relationship ran across 2 seasons and left permanent marks on both characters. Heidi went from sweet and innocent to someone damaged by an abusive relationship who eventually escaped it. That's real character development that could only happen with sustained storytelling. The serialization also taught the writers how to plant seeds that could pay off much later without requiring constant attention. Integrity Farms is the perfect example. It was introduced in season 22 and remained a recurring element through season 27, but it didn't dominate every episode. The farm would appear when relevant and disappear when it wasn't, creating continuity without imprisonment. This flexible approach to ongoing storylines became the show's new normal. Thematically, the serialized seasons tackled bigger ideas than most standalone episodes could. Season 19's examination of political correctness and gentrification and authenticity built across 10 episodes in the ways that created more depth than a single episode ever could. Season 20's exploration of internet trolling, nostalgia culture, and the degradation of truth in the social media age required sustained focus to fully develop. These weren't just funny observations. They were genuine commentary that needed space to breathe. The writing itself became more sophisticated in some ways, and the team learned how to weave together multiple storylines, how to plant callbacks that would pay off episodes later, how to develop themes that could evolve over time. Even when they returned to mostly episodic storytelling, that skill set remained. Episodes became better at referencing their own history without requiring it. A joke could land harder if you'd been watching for years, but it still worked if you hadn't. At the same time, something was lost. The pure chaos of early South Park, where literally anything could happen because nothing mattered past the end of the episode, became harder to recapture. Kenny's deaths had been funny, partially because they were consequence-free. The show could kill him in increasingly absurd ways, knowing he'd be fine next week. But as continuity mattered more, that kind of narrative nihilism felt less appropriate. The show also became more self-referential, which is a double-edged sword. Longtime fans loved seeing callbacks to earlier seasons and watching character arcs develop over years, but new viewers faced a steeper learning curve. Where you could once start watching South Park at any point in its run, by the late 2000s, you'd miss jokes and references if you didn't know the history. The show hadn't become impenetrable, but it had lost some of its accessibility. Fan and critical reception. The shift to serialization created a genuine divide in South Park's fan base that persists to this day. Go on any South Park forum or subreddit, and you'll find passionate arguments about whether serialization improved or ruined the show. It's remarkable how strongly people feel about what's ultimately just a storytelling format. Fans who loved the serialization point to season 19 as some of the show's best work. The PC principal storyline resonated because it addressed real cultural tensions in smart, funny ways that built over time. The gentrification subplot felt meaningful because you watched the town transform week by week, rather than just hearing about it in one episode. The Trump parody worked because it could evolve alongside the actual campaign, creating a running commentary that got funnier and more pointed as the real race got weirder. And these fans argue that serialization showed Trey and Matt still had new ideas after 2 decades. It proved South Park wasn't just coasting on its legacy, but actively experimenting with its format. The risks they took in seasons 19 and 20 demonstrated artistic ambition rather than safe, repetitive storytelling. Even when it didn't fully work, it was exciting to watch them try. On the other side, fans who hated serialization felt it betrayed everything that made South Park great. They argue the show worked best when you could tune in any week and get a complete story. The obligation to watch every episode in order made the viewing experience feel like homework rather than entertainment. Missing 1 week meant being lost the next, which ran counter to South Park's entire philosophy of accessible, immediate comedy. These critics point to season 20's messy conclusion as proof that serialization didn't suit the show's production method, and they argue Trey and Matt were forcing a format that worked for shows like Breaking Bad or Game of Thrones, but made no sense for a weekly animated comedy built around topical satire. The Trump election disaster proved they couldn't sustain long-form narratives while also reacting to unpredictable current events. Critically, the response mirrored this divide. Publications like the New York Times praised season 19 as ambitious and commended the show's willingness to evolve. James Poniewodzik called it something like a grand, if messy, unified theory of anger, inequality, and disillusionment in 2015 America. Other critics felt the serialization created more problems than it solved, with some calling season 20 bloated and unfocused. The ratings told their own story. Season 20's premiere, Member Berries, pulled 3.5 million viewers, the show's highest since 2006. Interest was clearly there for serialized South Park, but those numbers didn't fully hold through the season. And season 21's return to more episodic storytelling saw ratings stabilize rather than spike. The audience seemed okay with either approach, as long as the episodes were funny. What's interesting is how the discourse around this changed over time. When season 19 aired, the serialization felt novel and exciting. By season 21, even fans who'd loved it initially seemed ready for a change. The format had stopped feeling fresh and started feeling constraining. The shift back to episodic storytelling in seasons 21 to 23 was generally well received, suggesting the fan base was ready to move on even if they'd enjoyed the experiment. Today, discussions about the serialization era tend to view it as an interesting experiment that produced some great episodes, but ultimately wasn't sustainable. Season 19 gets praised as one of the show's better recent seasons. Season 20 gets acknowledged as ambitious, even though it didn't stick the landing. Seasons 21 to 26 are seen as finding a healthy middle ground. The consensus seems to be that the show learned valuable lessons from serialization without needing to stay married to the format. Lessons learned and current approach. By the time South Park reached its late 20s seasons, particularly 27 and 28, which aired in 2025, the show had evolved into something that incorporated lessons from both its episodic past and serialized experiment. It's not purely either approach anymore. Instead, it's become a hybrid that takes the best elements of both. Seasons 27 and 28 represent the current culmination of this evolution. These seasons were structured in a genuinely novel way for South Park. Instead of the traditional 10 consecutive episodes, they aired just 5 episodes each spread across several months, with 2 weeks between each new installment. This scheduling choice fundamentally changed how the show could approach storytelling, and the longer gaps between episodes gave Trey and Matt more time to work on each one. While they still maintained their basic production philosophy of making episodes quickly and reacting to current events, they weren't operating on the exact 6-day cycle anymore. They had breathing room to develop ideas more fully, to see how audiences reacted to previous episodes before creating new ones, and to let real-world events develop more fully before satirizing them. But here's what's crucial. They use this extra time to create tighter serialization within each mini-season, while maintaining the flexibility to start fresh with the next batch of episodes. Season 27 told one continuous story about Trump's relationship with Satan, yes, really, across its 5 episodes. Season 28 picked up that narrative and continued it, but the overall structure was less about strict episode-to-episode continuity and more about sustained thematic exploration. This approach solved many of the problems that plagued Season 20. By committing to shorter story arcs of 5 episodes rather than 10, they reduced the risk of painting themselves into narrative corners. If something unexpected happened in real life that disrupted their plans, they only had a few episodes left to adjust rather than an entire season. The stakes were lower, which paradoxically made them more willing to take risks, and the bi-weekly release schedule also changed the viewing experience. Instead of episodes airing and immediately disappearing into the past, each one sat in the cultural conversation for 2 weeks before the next arrived. This created more space for discussion, analysis, and anticipation. It was almost like how prestige dramas on streaming services release episodes, except South Park was still reacting to current events in ways those shows never could. Our Randy's Tegridy Farms arc finally concluded in Season 27 after running intermittently since Season 22. This demonstrated another lesson learned. You can maintain long-running storylines without making them the center of every episode. The farm existed for years as a recurring element that appeared when relevant and disappeared when it wasn't. When it finally ended, it felt earned rather than abrupt, showing how patient storytelling could work within South Park's framework. The current approach also embraces what Trey and Matt called getting back to having fun. After years of feeling obligated to comment on Trump and politics and the pandemic, they've given themselves permission to be silly again. Season 27 featured Trump dating Satan, which is absurd even by South Park standards. But it worked because they committed fully to the bit, while still making broader points about power and narcissism. They found a way to be topical and ridiculous simultaneously. In interviews about the current era, Matt Stone said they're at where a lot of people are at, which is the future kind of sucks. They would like to get back to where each week they can do something totally different, while acknowledging they're still kind of trapped talking about larger issues. That tension between wanting creative freedom and feeling obligated to address the cultural moment defines modern South Park. What they've settled on is a format that allows both. Within a 5-episode arc, they can tell a sustained story. Between arcs, they can completely reset and try something different. They can comment on Trump one batch of episodes and completely ignore him the next. They can develop long-running character arcs while also doing one-off episodes about whatever they find funny that week. The critical and fan response to this approach has been largely positive, and seasons 27 and 28 were praised for finding a sweet spot between serialization and episodic storytelling. The tighter focus of 5-episode arcs felt more manageable than season-long narratives, while the extended production timeline produced more polished episodes than the classic 6-day cycle allowed. It seems like they've finally found a sustainable model. Looking forward, this hybrid approach seems likely to define South Park for the foreseeable future. Trey and Matt have a massive deal with Paramount that guarantees the show through at least 2027 and includes multiple streaming specials. That structure supports the current model of shorter seasonal arcs, plus standalone specials addressing specific topics. They've built a format that works with their creative process, rather than against it. The show has also become more comfortable with its own history. Where earlier seasons rarely referenced previous episodes, a modern South Park freely calls back to its own mythology while making sure new viewers aren't completely lost. Callbacks work as rewards for long-time fans, rather than requirements for understanding the story. That's a difficult balance to strike, but they've gotten better at it. Ultimately, South Park's journey from pure episodic to full serialization and back to a hybrid approach reflects the show's core strength, the willingness to experiment and evolve. And most shows that run for 3 decades get trapped doing the same thing over and over because it's safe. South Park blew up its own format, tried something radically different, learned from the experience, and emerged with a more sophisticated understanding of how to tell stories, while maintaining the flexibility and topical relevance that made the show special in the first place. The serialization experiment wasn't a failure. It was an evolution. Season 19 proved they could do it when they wanted to. Season 20 proved they needed to be careful about when and how they committed to it. Seasons 21 and onward proved they'd learned how to cherry-pick the best elements of serialization, while preserving the episodic flexibility that their production method required. That's a pretty successful learning curve for a show most people thought had already figured out everything 2 decades earlier. So there you have it. The complete story of how South Park became serialized, why it happened, how it worked when it worked, why it crashed when it crashed, and where the show ended up after the dust settled. From the purely episodic chaos of the early years through the ambitious serialization of seasons 19 and 20, to the hybrid approach that defines modern South Park, the show's evolution reflects both its creators' creative restlessness and their willingness to learn from mistakes. The serialization era gave us PC Principal, one of the show's best new characters in years. It gave us the Member Berries and their creepy commentary on nostalgia. It gave us Season 19's cohesive examination of political correctness and American culture. But it also trapped the show in storylines it couldn't escape and exposed the fundamental incompatibility between serialized narrative planning and South Park's 1-week production cycle. What emerged from that experiment is arguably the best version of South Park yet. A show that can tell sustained stories when it wants to, but isn't imprisoned by them. A show that maintains its topical relevance while building genuine character development. A show that learned how to have both the freedom of episodic storytelling and the depth of serialization without being fully limited by either approach. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into South Park's evolution, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next video. We're building a complete archive of everything animated television has to offer, and you won't want to miss what's coming next.